Okay, you guys. So we just went live and we was on we did chapter 10, right? So I'm just gonna go over chapter 10 again, you guys. Sorry about all that. Okay, we're gonna just start on chapter 10 again, you guys. So chapter 10 in AR 735-5, right? Uh so self-serving statements. So when the findings rely on a self-serving statement in DD Form 200, Block 9, or in one of the exhibits, the financial liability officer will explain how that person's statement is confirmed by other evidence in the flipper. Financial liability officers will ensure they have received legal advice prior to interviewing someone who may be found liable. So 10-2, conflicting statements or evidence. When the findings rely on evidence which conflicts with other evidence, the financial liability officer will explain how the conflict was resolved. The flow will document how they resolve any conflicts. The use of other evidence and documentation provided during the investigation will be used to resolve any conflicts. Considerations. So the financial liability officer will consider various evidence when investigating the loss of property. The financial liability officer will determine whether a person's actions were the proximate cause for the loss of, damage to, or destruction of government property. The financial liability officer should consider the following before making a recommendation: degree of care and resourcefulness. The financial liability officer will weigh the actions of the person involved against those of a reasonable and prudent person. A prudent person is one who uses good judgment and common sense in handling practical matters, is careful about the conduct, and is wasteful or extravagant, and is not wasteful or extravagant in the use of resources. The financial liability officer will also consider age, experience, and special qualifications needed to do the job. The following scenarios help to illustrate these points. Private E2, Doug Doe, a non-driver, was attending a driver's training course. Hold on one second, you guys. Hold on. Okay, we was on the degree of care and resources, you guys. So the financial liability officer will weigh the actions of the persons involved against those of a reasonable and prudent person. A prudent person is one who uses good judgment and common sense in handling practical matters, is careful about the conduct, and is not wasteful or extravagant in the use of resources. The financial liability officer will also consider age, experience, and special qualifications needed to do the job. The following scenarios help to illustrate these points. Private E2, Doug Doe, a non-driver, was attending a driver's training course. His instructor told him to back the vehicle into the parking place. In attempting to place the vehicle in reverse, he inadvertently shifted into third gear. The vehicle leaped forward and struck a tree. In this case, the financial liability officer will consider Private E2 Doug Doe lack of driving experience. So, as you can see in that scenario, his lack of driving experience was considered in that scenario. Second one is 18-year-old Private Tom Doe, a new member in the unit while participating in his first field training exercise, was assigned to the aggressor forces. While trying to avoid being captured by the enemy forces, he found a high mobility multi-purpose wheel vehicle, got in, and drove off. The Humvee was assigned to First Lieutenant David Doe, who, when he noticed the Humvee being driven off by an unknown individual, shouted to Private Tom Doe to come back with his vehicle. Private Tom Doe, continuing to flee the enemy, drove off at a high speed. He did not stop until he discovered he was entangled in barbed wire, causing damage to the Humvee. Private Tom Doe's commanding officer and his platoon leader both stated he was caught up in his aggressor's role and that he was totally intent on accomplishing his mission of avoiding capture by the enemy forces. In this case, the financial liability officer would consider Private Tom Doe's age and his lack of experience. In this case, the financial liability officer would consider Private Tom Doe's age and his lack of experience. The financial liability officer could recommend he be relieved of responsibility for the damage to the Humvee if these elements are believed to be warranted. Responsibility of the persons for the property, personal or non-personal. When a person holds property like OCIE, personal arms, binoculars, or hand tools that have been issued to him or her for personal use, he or she has personal responsibility. When a person converts property to his or her own without use, without permission or authority, as when an individual steals a vehicle, that person has personal responsibility. When a person commands or supervises others who use property or have custody of property, that person has non-personal responsibility. If there was non-personal responsibility, the following elements can affect a decision. Okay, so it said those elements can affect a decision, you guys. So like I was saying, so non-personal responsibility, right? So you want to make sure you sign all that stuff down to I guess another person, right? So that way you don't become responsible for that damage to the property or whatever. So what can affect a decision is the nature of the property, the nature, extent, and complexity of the organization or activity he or she commanded or supervised. How feasible was it to keep close supervision over the property? The financial liability officer will check the factors that contributed to the loss or damage. The adequacy of the measures set up for the supervision of subordinates to ensure property was properly used and cared for and that proper custody and safekeeping were provided. The extent to which supervision by a commander activity supervisor may have been hampered by other pressing duties or by a lack of qualified assistance. Possibility of fraud, collusion, or willful misconduct. If there's any suspicion of fraud, collusion, or other willful misconduct incident to a property loss on the part of a service member or DA civilian employee, the financial liability officer must be especially careful to thoroughly investigate the facts. Fraud is the misinterpretation of truth to induce another to part with something of value or to surrender a legal right. It is also a deceitful act with the intent to deprive another of their rights or to cause them injury. Collusion is a secret agreement and cooperation for a fraudulent or deceitful purpose. When such suspicions reasonably exist, the financial liability officer must not recommend relief from property responsibility or financial liability until all involved persons are completely clear of suspicion. So, findings and recommendations. So the financial liability officer findings and recommendations are administrative and not judicial. Therefore, findings and recommendations. Hold on 1 second, you guys. Hold on 1 second, you guys. Okay. Where I'm at. Okay. I'm on the financial liability officer's findings and recommendations are administrative and not judicial. Therefore, findings and recommendations are purely advisory and do not constitute a final determination or legal judgment. The recommendations are not binding upon the appointing authority or the approving authority. However, if the financial liability officer has conducted the investigation without prejudice or bias, has documented findings clearly and identified the supporting documentation, and has recommendations that are reasonable and just, those recommendations are more likely to be accepted by the appointing authority and approving authority. A finding is a conclusion reached by the financial liability officer during his or her investigation of the facts and circumstances surrounding the loss of or damage of government property. Findings are supported by evidence contained on DD Form 200, Block 9, or exhibits attached to the flipper. When writing findings, exclude personal speculation, suspicion, or opinion not supported by the evidence. Findings are the conclusions which form the basis for making recommendations and must be factual. The financial liability officer must state the facts in his or her own words. Findings will be complete as possible to enable the reviewers to ascertain relief from or assessment of financial liability. If the financial liability officer's findings rely on a self-serving statement in Block 9 or in one of the exhibits made by a person who was personally responsible for the property listed on DD Form 200 at the time of the loss, the financial liability officer findings must explain how that person's statement is confirmed by other independently documented evidence, if available, or by any other evidence of reliability that the financial liability officer considers relevant. If the financial liability officer findings rely on evidence which conflicts with other evidence, the financial liability officer must explain how the conflict was resolved. After recording the findings, the financial liability officer must develop a logical recommendation based on his or her findings, applying the guidance contained in this regulation. And then you will enter the findings in Block 15 of DD Form 200 per table C-2. So reference the exhibit supporting the findings. A financial liability officer will show the findings are supported by evidence by referring to the exhibits in sequence. The following are examples. Sergeant First Class John Doe had personal responsibility for the missing property based on the hand receipt at Exhibit A. Specialist Tom Doe was driving the vehicle above the posted speed limit based on the military police report at Exhibit B. The supply room was left unattended and unsecured on the evening of 1 October 14 based on the charge of quarters log at Exhibit C. So you guys just make sure you have all your exhibits. I don't care anything that could affect the liability. You guys want to make sure you have those exhibits. If a person saying they was in S2, just for example, they say they was in S2 during the time that I guess the property came up missing, you can go to S2 and they should have a sign-in log. Get the sign-in log and you can add that as an exhibit for proof that he wasn't around during that time or whatever. So recommendations. After recording the findings, the financial liability officer develops logical recommendations based on the findings and the guidance in this regulation. See chapters 10 and 13 for examples of types of losses and the considerations that should be made in determining whether assessment of financial liability officer is appropriate. Chapter 13 provides special considerations for specific types of property. Enter recommendations of findings in DD Form 200, Block 15. When findings reveal no negligence or willful misconduct, the financial liability officer will recommend relieving all persons concerned of responsibility. For example, the recommendations may read, recommend all persons be relieved of responsibility and accountability for the property loss. When findings reveal there was negligence or willful misconduct on the part of one or more individuals, the financial liability officer will determine if the negligence was the proximate cause for the loss. Consider whether without the negligent act or acts would the loss have occurred. Liability for losses should not be assessed when the negligent act or willful misconduct is not the proximate cause of the loss. This does not preclude the commander, activity supervisor from taking other administrative or disciplinary action against the individual committing the negligent acts or willful misconduct. So if something was lost, right? But it wasn't the proximate cause, or the person negligent acts or willful misconduct is not the proximate cause for that loss. Of course, those people won't be found liable for that, but they can still get reprimanded from the commander, right? Okay, so let me see. When the negligent acts or willful misconduct is the proximate cause of the loss, the person responsible for the negligent act or willful misconduct should be recommended for assessment of financial liability for the cost of the loss. For example, recommend individual's name, grade, and social be held financial liability in the amount of, compute the amount of financial liability per Chapter 5. When recommending charges of financial liability against an individual, the financial liability officer will include the individual's monthly base pay at the time of the loss in DD Form 200, Block 15. The financial liability officer, financial liability officer will also include the expected date of the persons responsible for the negligent acts, termination of service, or employment in block 15. When more than one person's negligent act or willful misconduct is the proximate cause for the loss, those persons should be recommended for assessment of collective financial liability. Use phrase collective financial liability when more than one person is found financial liable for a loss. For example, recommend individuals' name, grade, and social, and identify others being recommended by name, grade, and social. Be held collectively financially liability in the amount of and dollar amount respectively. Compute the proportional amounts of collective financial liability per Chapter 7. The financial liability officer will include the individual's monthly base pay at the time of the loss and expected dates of the persons responsible for the negligent acts, expiration of term of service, or termination of employment. The financial liability officer recommendations should also recommend disposition of the accounting requirements for the lost property, a recommendation to relieve all concerned of accountability for the lost items, or a recommendation that accountability continue and damaged property be repaired and returned to service may be appropriate depending on the circumstance. So you guys, there you go for Chapter 10, you guys. Sorry about the last live I did. I be getting it mixed up with far as adding my stuff to the stage and making sure I'm not muted. So that's the findings and recommendation, you guys, with the flow. Basically, nothing that they put inside the DD Form 200 can conflict with anything, and everything has to be supported by an exhibit. So, and you as a supply sergeant, you want to make sure you gather all those exhibits, right? So, yeah. So, basically, to save some time and to make the process a little quicker before you even initiate the flip, will go ahead and get all this stuff, and so you can ascertain the facts, right? So that's all I got for you guys. Sorry for being muted the last time. We won't be muted next week. I'll make sure everything is good. So next week we're going over Chapter 11, actions after making the recommendations. So you guys got any input on what I went over, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next week.